Just over half of Canada's population is female, but only 27% of the seats in the House of Commons belong to women. It's a disconnect that some of Canada's parliamentarians are studying in the hopes of identifying and overcoming the roadblocks facing women in politics. So what challenges are they confronting? And when it comes to breaking down gender barriers, whose responsibility is it to take action? Joining me from Gabriola Island in British Columbia is NDP critic for women's equality and vice chair of the Standing Committee on the Status of Women, Sheila Malcolmson. In Medicine Hat, Alberta, United Conservative Party nomination candidate Michaela Glasgow, and in Toronto, the executive director of the Samara Centre for Democracy, Jane Hilderman. Hi to all of you. Thank you so much for being with me. I appreciate it. Ms. Malcolmson, I'm going to start with you because you're the vice chair of the committee. You've had 5 meetings so far. You've heard from 38 witnesses. Members of the public are actually invited to submit briefs, and they will be, I think, until July 6th. I'm just wondering if there are certain themes that have started to emerge based on what you've heard.
I mean, people won't be surprised to hear we've had a great range of witnesses, super diversity, and the consensus we're hearing so far. There are barriers to women running for office and being elected, as is evidenced by our parliament right now, just 26% women at this rate. It's going to take us, I don't know, what does Equal Voice say, another 100 years in order to get equity. So we've got work to do in Parliament and in our communities to remove those barriers to women getting elected, because countries do better when the parliaments reflect the diversity of the countries that they serve.
Is there anything you've heard from the testimony so far, Ms. Malcolmson, that surprised you?
No. We went through a really long, hard election campaign. We heard a lot in 2015 about why there were not more women elected. And we're glad that this issue is getting an airing, although it certainly would have been better to have built this into the Elections Act amendments. This is, we hope it's not just an airing of problems, but, really it is late in this term to make changes in time for the next election. But if we can find tweaks, then we'll certainly hope that the government implements them.
And Ms. Glasgow, you testified before the committee. What's the gist of what you wanted them to know?
On the whole, I kind of disagree with Ms. Malcolmson. I don't necessarily agree that we need to be inputting anything from the government. I think that the best thing that we can do for women is to recognize them as distinct and powerful human beings who have something to offer to the political realm. And I think the best thing that we can do to empower them or to bring them forward is to just encourage them to run. And I think that if we encourage them to run and we have good structures within our parties and within our government that allow for women to run, so essentially just having a seat at the table, if you pull up a chair, you're better off than sitting at home. And I think the best thing to do here is just to acknowledge that there's nothing that can replace grassroots initiative. And I think that the United Conservative Party, our internal party election this past May, proved that to be quite true. There's no quotas whatsoever, and we actually have a quote-unquote gender-balanced board of directors.
Do you feel, or in your experience, do you think there are, I understand your point about pulling up a chair to the table, but do you think it's harder for women to pull a chair up to that table?
I think the biggest barriers that we create are actually with each other. And I spoke to this in the committee. We have groups of women and groups of political beings and political parties in general who actually treat women as a lock and step identity category, assuming their partisanship based on nothing more than their gender. I think that's quite insulting, personally. And I know that the leader of the United Conservative Party also thinks that as well. He's quoted that in Story of a Tory, the blog that I co-founded with a bunch of other conservative women. And I think the biggest thing there, Vashi, is that we need to make sure that we're encouraging women, but we're also not reducing them to their gender. So I think actually that the biggest barrier that women face in politics is actually the political parties themselves and the proclivity of the general public to put women into lock and step identity categories, not allowing them to identify on the basis of their own merit and be elected on that.
I want to get Ms. Malcolmson to respond, but first I just want to ask Ms. Hilderman, because you've done extensive research on this idea, and I know you interviewed a number of MPs, outgoing MPs. What did you find in the what did your research show you about the idea of barriers and if women face them proportionately more so than men?
Yeah, I would like to speak to the research that you mentioned with former members of parliament. We sat down last year with 54 members, 23 of whom were women, who all served in the 41st parliament. And when asked about what sort of experience they had, we did find that women volunteered the fact that they feel that they had often a somewhat different experience than their male counterparts, in that many said that they felt that they had to work twice as hard to sort of to be recognized, to be heard, to be held sort of with the same sort of seniority or seriousness in terms of some of their male counterparts. But that's just for the women who got there, who managed to win their nomination and win the election. I think others spoke to the fact that, that process of getting in can be a bit of a black box, that nominations till this day are still subject to some opacity and could be opened up in a way that might be more conducive to supporting not just the participation of women, but for anyone who maybe isn't been inside a party and very familiar with its operating structures to participate in political life.
Ms. Malcolmson, what do you think of the idea that Ms. Glasgow put forward that women, the biggest barrier women face are sort of being reduced to just their gender?
I've heard conservatives say that a lot, and I've also heard conservatives said, as your guest just did, really it's about women's attitude, and if they just bellied up to the bar, then they can have anything and do anything. That's just not borne out by the evidence. The Conservative Party federally had 17% of its nominees were women, and therefore, 16% of their caucus is women. NDP nominated 43% women, and as a result, 40% of our caucus is female. The evidence says if you get women on the ballot, voters will choose them. And we've got fantastic candidates and fantastic MPs and all across the country. There are real barriers. I mean, we hear the evidence says that a woman on average has to be asked 11 times to run because you're balancing childcare and elder care and income and all those pieces. Men on average get asked once and they're all in. So an example for the NDP, riding associations are not allowed to go to a nomination process until they can say that they've exhausted the opportunities to recruit Indigenous, people of color, women, so-called equity candidates. It doesn't mean that they get the spot, but that they are put before the membership to choose. And so that's an example of something that political parties can do. My colleague Kennedy Stewart brought legislation to Parliament in the first year that we sat, I guess 2016. Unfortunately, it was voted down by the Liberals, which is really too bad because it would have created incentives, financial incentives for parties who present a candidate slate that reflects the diversity of the country. The barriers are real, but if we get women and other equity-seeking groups in the seats of our parliaments, then we do a better job of representing the diversity of the country, and we engage more people in the electoral system, and voter participation goes up. And all the countries around the world that have proportional representation governments where every vote counts, they all elect way more women. Our standing in the world is very poor, and it's because we really haven't updated our election system for a long time, and that would remove barriers, getting more diversity in our parliaments.
Ms. Glasgow, did you have to be asked 11 times to run?
I was asked a couple times for sure, but that wasn't because I didn't believe in myself. That was because I wanted to make sure that I was the most qualified candidate and that I was ready to go. I mean, it's no surprise that running in a nomination isn't easy work. I mean, it takes a lot of mental stamina. It takes a lot of emotional. It's a lot of emotional working out as well. I mean, you're knocking on doors every day. You're speaking to people. You are talking about the issues. You're researching. You're doing all of this at the same time. You're basically juggling 15 different plates at the same time. And I mean, yeah, it's stressful and it's everything else, but I had to be asked a few times, yeah, because I'm 25 and I'm running in a nomination, and it is not something that generally happens. And I think that that's a shame. So the fact that I was asked, though, did actually prompt me in order to put myself forward. Did I self-identify? Not at first, but I think that what we're hearing here is that there are parties that seem to think that the only way that we're going to get this parity or whatever is by seeking out these women and seeking out these candidates, and I don't agree. I think if you are ready for this, you will step up to the table, which is exactly what I did. If you have the experience and if you have the stamina, please, by all means, step up. But at the end of the day, if my winning is based on the party putting in another hurdle for me, which is what I think a quota is, if my winning is based on that, that's not a win for me, and I don't think that's a win for anybody else. I think that what we should be doing, Vashi, and fundamentally, is we should be finding qualified people, period. Whether that's women, whether that's men, whatever that looks like, it's qualified people who care about their communities, who are willing to do the work. And that's personally what I bring to the table, and why I decided to run in the United Conservative Party nomination for Brooks Medicine Hat. So I don't think that had anything to do with the fact that I was a woman, and I certainly wouldn't be happy if the party was protecting me in any way or suggesting that I needed to be because I was a woman. In fact, I would think that's quite insulting.
Ms. Hilderman, can I ask you about sort of the range of options that either political parties or the government have at their disposal if they do decide that this is a problem that they want to tackle?
Well, I think what Sheila and Michaela have added is totally correct, that right now our politics is really dependent upon the architecture of our parties to do the candidate recruitment, to then mentor and train up candidates and support them to have a successful campaign experience, and hopefully once they get into office, mentor them further. I guess a big question that this committee in their study is tackling is, should this be left to the parties, or is there a role for government to intervene and try to standardize this process? In my point of view, it's really hard, I think, to crouch in too far on parties, but I do think there's a great option before the committee, which is to recommend that Elections Canada have a greater role, especially in overseeing the nomination process. And again, this would be something that I think helps everybody in terms of ensuring that there's sort of an equal playing field, equal rules applied, that the rules are very open and fair for all entrants to the political race. So in that way, I think it would appeal to people like Michaela who say, okay, let me prove on the basis of my effort and merit that I'm going to be the best candidate for you.
Okay, I have to leave it there, but thank you to all three of you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. Thanks to Sheila Malcolmson, Michaela Glasgow, and Jane Hilderman. The Status of Women Committee is accepting written briefs on the barriers facing women in politics until this Friday. We'll keep you posted on their findings.